Let's talk about how Christian nationalists have rewritten the history of the United States founding over the past 50 years. Now, we've heard a lot about American history and the American Revolution and the characters supposedly found at the beginning of the United States over the last couple months due to the semi-quincentennial celebrations. Think about the Rededicate 250 event, a day of thanksgiving and praise and rededication to God that took place on the U.S. Mall last month. Think about the 4th of July celebrations this last weekend with Donald Trump giving the very, very late night address in which he deifies the founding fathers, or think about the remarks that Donald Trump has given at a number of prayer breakfasts, including just this year when he said, quote, "We're going to rededicate America as one nation under God." And of course, it doesn't end with Trump. You have the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, with his very outright militant Christian nationalism, and Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who similarly is dedicated, and more on Johnson in a bit. Now, when I talk about how Christian nationalism has rewritten the founding in order to reaffirm their notions of Christian nationalist principles, I often get questions of what do you mean by Christian nationalism? So I thought I'd give 5 key principles before I dig into the historical rewriting of what scholars typically mean. This definition comes from the Public Religion Research Institute. It's not perfect, I have my quibbles, but it's a generally agreed upon definition, so it's useful here. There are 5 key elements that go into Christian nationalism. 1, that the United States government should declare America a Christian nation. 2, that United States laws should be based on Christian values. 3, that if the United States moves away from their Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. 4, being Christian is part of what it means to truly be American. And 5, God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all of American society. Now, note the specifics of that definition. That doesn't include all people who just believe that God blesses America. That's a more mild form of Christian nationalism. What we're talking about here is the clear and dominionist theology of Christian history, which requires a rewriting of the past to justify that expression. Because the idea of America being founded as an explicitly Christian nation along these principles is a lot more recent than you might think. It's also the result of explicit political strategizing in the wake of World War II. So in this video, I want to dig into the complicated history of religion in the United States founding, how this new history was rewritten in the second half of the 20th century, and how it has severe consequences for today. Let's dig in. Now, I've covered religion and the United States founding several times on this channel. It's a topic I talk about in my classes every semester. And it's very complicated, something that often gets too simplified both by Christian nationalists, but also by secularists who try to erase all mentions of religion in the founding. The truth is, when you look at who we call the founding fathers, those elite white men who exerted influence over declaring independence and then the creation of a new constitution and governing the early republic, there was a broad range of beliefs. Some were devout Christians, some were not. What they held in common, however, and this is not reducing them all into what I call a founder stein to where they all hold the same beliefs, but one common through line that he found throughout most of the founding fathers was a belief that the United States should break the cycle of denominational clashes in which religion drives politics, or churches drive politics, into something that grants more toleration, introducing a free marketplace in which all religious expressions have at least a modicum of freedom in the new nation. This was an explicit rejection of a framework in which a particular notion of Christianity should dominate politics and frame laws and be established in the land. The U.S. Constitution, of course, written in 1787 and then ratified over the next couple of years, was the first major constitution coming from the Western society that explicitly does not reference God, nor does it establish a religion. And then when you look at the first 3 presidents, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, Jefferson, they all differed in terms of how they viewed religion roles in society, but they did all explicitly reject the notion that the United States is a Christian nation. George Washington received petitions to declare the United States was the Christian nation that he explicitly rejected. John Adams approved the Treaty of Tripoli, which explicitly said the United States is not a Christian nation, which is why we're able to do treaties with Islamic nations. And Thomas Jefferson, of course, authored the letter on the separation between church and state, a phrase that we're going to get to in a bit, which he believed was separating explicit dogma from dominating who gets to be called Christian. He also rejected the tradition that Washington and Adams had practiced of declaring fast days because he saw that as too much political involvement in the religious sphere. Now, this doesn't mean that religion didn't play a crucial role in the founding. I'm a scholar of religion in the founding republic. Religion played a crucial role. Fast days, for instance, is one example. But what we often see simplified in these modern day caricatures and this historical rewriting that I'm going to talk about in a minute is a simplification and an ahistorical take of looking at ideas of general morality for an explicit religious Christian dogma. Because again, one of the common through lines throughout many of the founding figures is a skepticism toward ecclesiastical intervention and dogmatic oversight. That, in other words, if religion should survive, and many of them believe that religion should survive and flourish, it should not receive any privileges from the state. And very quickly, by the way, I'll add that there's sometimes this opposite caricature, a mirror funhouse creation often made by a secular left about the founding fathers all being deists and skeptics, which is often overstated. Even Thomas Jefferson embraced the title of Christian, although he redefined what Christian meant and rejected the divinity of Jesus Christ. And many of them believed in, the notion of prayer and whatnot. But rejecting that caricature should not also mean embracing the Christian right mythic ahistorical take that the founding fathers were all devoted Christians, because this complicated layered understanding of the founding is rarely useful for contemporary politics, which is why it had to be reshaped. By the way, before I go much further, if you enjoy this type of historical content where we geek out over history and look at its modern day consequences and relevance, please make sure you're subscribed to this channel. I try to do deep dives on topics every Monday. I connect the past to the present on contemporary issues on Wednesdays. And then on Fridays, I pull back the curtains and talk about the historian's craft, either interviewing authors of new books, examining classic texts, or digging into primary sources so that you can see what goes on behind classic interpretations. And if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have chosen to give back and make this channel possible, you can become a member, where for a very nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get icons next to your name when you leave comments, but most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing, rigorous scholarship, showing the relevance of history to our modern day. And you can also follow me on different platforms, especially Instagram, where I provide supplemental materials. And I encourage you to subscribe to my Kit newsletter, where I send out notices every other week or so with links to videos, announcements, updates, all that good stuff. But the bread and butter, of course, are these videos on the channel. So thanks again for those of you who have supported me through this. So let's get back to today's content. In the wake of World War II, there were two big cultural groups in the United States who really need an improvement in their public reputation, and they're going to align with each other on a explicitly strategic initiative to work together and build the modern United States. One group was the evangelicals and the devout Christians, sometimes defined as fundamentalists, although those terms are a bit more complicated that I don't want to go into here. In the wake of the Scopes Monkey trial and the big public clashes with modernists, evangelicals were seen as a bit too irrational, as not good actors in modern day society, and so there's a lot of skepticism of whether we could trust them. At the same time, And I should note that this is at the same time that America is becoming more religious. It's just a type of brand or activity of religion which is under threat. And at the same time, big businesses are also seen as poor contributors to the United States. This is in the wake of the Great Depression, where many saw that corporate greed plunge the United States into a crisis. I know that doesn't sound anything familiar with what we've experienced since then. The New Deal was, of course, very pro-labor, and so these big CEOs and corporations were having a hard go. And then in the wake of World War II, you see a fusion between those two groups, the creation of what scholars call a Christian libertarianism, where religion and many of these ministers like Billy Graham are willing to work with these corporations to create a notion of Christian America that is going to buttress both these evangelicals and conservative dogmatic Christians and big business principles. The apotheosis, of course, was the election of Dwight Eisenhower, who benefited more than nearly any other politician by this coalition, who then in return was able to do things like make one nation under God the national motto, adding "in God we trust" to the currency, and all this apotheosis of Christian nationalism, this notion of the Christian nation, of course, being around for a long time, but really taking a new stage and being much more prominent during a result of the Strategic Alliance, which creates a new formation of a Christian nationalism, fusion of conservative politics, free market economics, and patriarchal values. But in order to make that ideology stick, which was far from assured, right? Elements of that had been associated with different movements before, but to make that particular conglomeration sustainable, they needed to rewrite the past to show that it was a logical creation. This is also a rejection of progressive politics and academic scholarship, which had been arguing for a more progressive view of history, of the living notion of the Constitution, and of the Founding Fathers as flawed individuals that we need to improve on. So instead, this Christian nationalist push rewrites history to say that we have always had this cultural coalition. We have always been a Christian nation, and a Christian nation with particular principles and histories. This escalates and almost culminates in the bicentennial celebration of 1976. Note how in the semi-quincentennial this year, or the 250th anniversary, how so many people frame their identities and their movements around the American founding. And the same thing happens during the bicentennial, perhaps even more so, as the nation is divided during the culture wars and Richard Nixon's Watergate, and importantly, this new coalition of the religious right, the moral majority, who need texts that are going to rewrite the past to serve a purpose in the present. Texts like Peter Marshall and David Manuel's The Light and the Glory, which asks on the title page, did God have a plan for America? And the answer, of course, being yes, because the founders were Christians that argued God's hand is found in that history, and therefore that gives support for our modern day iterations. And by the way, many of you know I'm working on a project on Cleon Skousen, the prominent Mormon theologian and political pundit, who does similar work on these veins, not just with his famous book, The 5,000-Year Leap, which would later become a national bestseller, but with workshops like The Miracle of America, where he was training 10,000 Americans a week outside the Latter-day Saint tradition of seeing the founding fathers as these Christian men, rewriting the past again to fit the modern political present. And so there are some key takeaways here. It's clear that the modern day iteration of seeing America as a Christian nation with a particular Christian history is a modern invention, that it's an explicit rejection of academic scholarship. I cannot emphasize enough how this modern Christian America narratives directly conflict with scholarship and are ahistorical to their core, and that yes, there are plenty of historical myths found on the secular left as well. I've already addressed some in this video. But the degree of divergence in these Christian narratives from the actual historical record is substantial. And that's the point. Perhaps no one embodied this rewriting of the past for the present day as successfully as David Barton, the Dallas-based Christian historical influencer who received a bachelor's in Christian education from Oral Roberts, a very prominent evangelical college, began as a youth pastor, But they became quite popular due to his revisionist history, explicitly rejecting modern scholarship and its nuances in order to create a Christian past that serves the needs of the Christian present, directly challenging, for instance, the idea of a separation between church and state. His organization is called the Wall Builders because he's attacking these ideas of building the wall between church and state, arguing that the First Amendment was actually building a wall from the government influencing religion, not for religion to influence government, and that Jefferson's wall was solely meant to protect monotheistic faiths, most importantly, evangelical Christians. And one book that captures this, I can do an entire video series on David Barton and his ahistorical takes and how they have become crucial to these national myths. Perhaps one example that captures it is his 2012 book, The Jefferson Lies, which became a national bestseller, which shows kind of the silos of knowledge that evangelicals over the last 50 years had cultivated this arena in which these ahistorical takes can become very popular. It argues that all these lies about Jefferson, both as a skeptic, as having fathering children with an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, as not being this Christian libertarian founder, which makes sense in the Christian evangelical nationalist world, receives so much blowback from historians, including conservative Christian historians, that the conservative Christian publisher, Thomas Nelson, took this New York Times best-selling book off his print list. That's how much blowback, how ahistorical the book is. But of course, it then only sold more copies, and Glenn Beck, who has been a big champion of David Barton, promised to reprint it on his own. I think Barton ended up self-printing it himself, which made sense because he was able to make a lot more money of it. And David Barton has really influenced the religious right and its control over these historical myths. He spent decades working for the Texas Republican Party and still shapes their creation of, say, Common Core education for secondary schools. He's often featured on right-wing media, especially Glenn Beck, who sees him, I think he once called him an encyclopedia in shoes, which it's a very ahistorical encyclopedia, but that's a point for another day. He has worked explicitly for political candidates like Mike Huckabee and Ted Cruz, especially those who merge closely with the evangelical right, including Donald Trump, and perhaps most importantly, he is beloved by the current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who echoes the very Christianist nationalist myths created by David Barton to justify the Christian nationalist ideas today. So I know I'm repeating myself, but it's important to note that the ahistorical creation of this Christian founding is directly a modern result that rejects scholarship and is meant to supplement a political agenda today. Now, by the way, if you want more about this creation, there's a brand new book by Warren Throckmorton, a devoted and conservative Christian who has tried to push back against these myths, and he's got a brand new book, The Christian Past That Wasn't, Debunking the Christian Nationalist Myths That Hijack History, that I strongly recommend. All right, I want to close this video by talking about a few consequences that have come with this movement that, in Throckmorton's words, hijack history due to creating these myths for political gains. One is for those who reject this type of history, because as Americans have increasingly rejected religious conservatism, here's a poll showing the decline of those who identify as religious, including white evangelical. They have also come to reject these patriarch myths that have become attached to that Christian nationalist idea. Here's a decline from a recent Gallup survey that shows that there is a concomitant drop in those who are proud to be United States citizens. So in other words, a politicized Christianity that is becoming less popular is also dragging nationalism down along with it, which means that we are having a decline in just how people view their being proud of being citizen because it is attached with this Christian nationalism. But I also want to talk about the consequences for those who have embraced this Christian nationalist agenda, which, of course, those who watch my channel are not surprised by. These marginalized groups like Mormons who were able to gain a place at the table by embracing these Christian nationalist myths, the result of people like W. Cleon Skousen, think that they are safe within this coalition. But those pragmatic alliances are always skin deep. I think it's important to note how the Christian nationalist movement is at its heart an implicitly secular agenda, because it's downplaying theological dogma and playing up a notion of power. It's prioritizing this pragmatic alliance to gain political victory at the expense of these Christian theological principles. Which means that when these groups, like the Mormons, who were previously hated and marginalized, are able to get a space, that space is never fully assured. So just as an example, last week, Pete Hegseth's favorite minister, Douglas Wilson, who has spoken at the Pentagon this year, told the Salt Lake Tribune that in an ideal world, Latter-day Saints would not hold elected office. And of course, this coming on the heels when the Latter-day Saints were not granted the designation of Christian in the Pentagon's list of Christian affiliations or religious affiliations. So it's a reminder that this Christian label, so important at the heart of Christian nationalism, and this rewriting of the past, is both unstable, ever-evolving, but also increasingly unpopular and dangerous. And the consequences of that, I think, are still to be seen. So to conclude, I want to reaffirm three main points about these Christian nationalist myths that rewrite history in order to match a present-day agenda. One, they're ahistorical. They don't match the historical record, which is much more nuanced and complicated, and in some ways directly contradictory to how they're presented too. Two, they are directly political. They are made to fit a modern strategic alliance with partisan aims, which is the ironic and secular twist at the heart of Christian nationalism. And third, the creation is recent. While there are notions of Christian nationalism and the founding fathers as devout believers that you can find all the way back to the founding, the degree of that idea and the framework through which it's understood was explicitly created in the wake of World War II and has been cultivated over the past half century or so, which means that it hasn't been around or as solid as many assume. I hope this video made sense. I hope this adds some context to our modern day discussions. And I hope when you see these iterations and presentations of these Christian nationalist myths, you are able to see past the partisan facade to the much more complicated history that sadly holds way more important and relevant lessons for us today. It's another example of how history has never been more relevant than it is right now, and why these discussions are so important.